The dawn did not break so much as it bruised the horizon, transforming the eastern sky from a dull, lifeless slate into a shade of sickly, luminous green that Levi Dawson had not seen in nearly a decade. He stood at the window of his ranch house, the porcelain of his coffee mug sapping the warmth from his calloused hands, and watched the weather turn against him. At 43, Levi possessed a face that looked like it had been carved from the very limestone ridges that bordered his property, etched deep by sun, wind, and a solitude so profound it had become a physical weight. He knew this land. He knew the way the cheatgrass hissed before a rain and the way the air thinned before a freeze, but this sky was speaking a language of violence. It wasn't just a winter storm rolling down from the peaks. It was a white erasure coming to wipe the world clean. He turned from the window, pouring the untouched coffee into the sink. The ranch was his fortress, built post by post and wire by wire after his father had gambled away their ancestral legacy, leaving Levi with nothing but a bitter lesson. Reliance on others was the quickest path to ruin. He had rebuilt his life on the bedrock of isolation, owing no bank, no neighbor, and no friend. But as the wind suddenly slammed against the siding, sounding like a physical blow from a giant's fist, Levi knew that his fortress was about to be besieged. The transition from mourning to chaos was instantaneous. One moment, the world was a silent, ominous gray. The next, the air was a screaming vortex of ice crystals that defied gravity, moving sideways with the velocity of buckshot. Levi grabbed his heavy sheepskin coat, jamming his hat low over his eyes, and shoved the door open. The wind nearly tore the heavy oak panel from his grip, stealing the breath from his lungs in a shocking vacuum of cold. Visibility dropped to zero within seconds. The barn, usually a massive, comforting silhouette 70 yards away, had vanished into the churning milk of the blizzard. Panic, cold and sharp, spiked in his chest. His herd of 300 Herefords was scattered across the south pasture, exposed and vulnerable. These cattle were not just animals. They were the physical manifestation of 20 years of dawn-to-dusk labor, the living proof that he had survived his father's failures. If they panicked in this white hell, they would turn tail to the wind and drift blindly until they stacked up against the barbed wire fences or fell into the deep ravines to freeze in standing pillars of ice. Levi lowered his head and sprinted toward the stable, the snow scouring his face with the abrasive force of sandpaper, erasing the path beneath his boots. Inside the stable, the air was frigid but still, smelling of old hay and nervous horse sweat. His mare, usually steady as a rock, rolled her eyes and pinned her ears flat against her skull, sensing the barometric violence outside. She fought him as he threw the saddle on, her muscles bunching in protest, but Levi didn't have time for gentleness. He cinched the girth tight and swung up, driving her out into the maelstrom. The world outside had ceased to exist. There was only the wind and the biting cold that found every microscopic gap in his clothing, sliding icy fingers against his skin to steal his core heat. He pushed the mare toward the south pasture, navigating by memory alone. When he finally found the edge of the herd, it was a scene of disaster. The cattle were already moving, a lowing, terrified mass of brown hides disappearing into the whiteout. They were running blind, driven by instinct and fear, heading straight for the treacherous drops of the creek bed. Levi screamed at them, spurring his horse to cut off the lead cow, but the wind tore the sound from his throat and scattered it into the void. He was one man against the wrath of the sky, and he was losing. The disaster happened in a heartbeat. He tried to force the mare into a sharp turn to block a breakaway group of heifers, but the snow concealed a treacherous dip in the earth. The horse stumbled, her front legs buckling into a drift, and Levi was launched from the saddle. He hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the wind out of him, his face grinding into the frozen crust of the snowpack. He scrambled to his feet, tasting the copper tang of blood from a bitten lip, watching his mare scramble up and dance away, spooked and unreachable. He stood alone in the center of the blizzard, watching the dark shapes of his livelihood fade into the screaming white curtain. A heavy, suffocating despair crashed over him, heavier than the snow. This was it. The nightmare he had spent 2 decades outrunning had finally caught him. He was going to lose everything, just like his father, not because of a deck of cards, but because of his own inability to control the uncontrollable. He was watching his life disintegrate, helpless and small, when a shape materialized from the storm. It wasn't a cow. It was tall, dark, and moved with a fluid grace that seemed alien in the violent wind. At first, Levi thought he was hallucinating, his mind conjuring a savior out of desperation and hypoxia. But the figure sharpened into reality, a rider on a large, dark bay horse, cutting through the blizzard with impossible calm. The rider wore a long duster coat heavily dusted with snow, a scarf wrapped high around their face, and a hat pulled low. They didn't acknowledge Levi. Their focus was entirely on the cattle. With a sharp whistle that somehow cut through the gale, the stranger spurred their mount forward. The horse moved like a cutting horse in a show ring, responding to the slightest shift of the rider's weight, diving in and out of the terrified herd. It was a masterclass in stockmanship. The rider wasn't chasing the cattle. They were guiding them, using the animal's own momentum to turn the tide. Levi watched, stunned and frozen, as the stranger intercepted the lead cow, turning her head away from the ravine and back toward the safety of the barn. The rest of the herd followed the leader, flowing like a river of molasses around the dark stone of the rider. Levi shook off his shock, caught his mare's trailing reins, and remounted, joining the effort. But he felt less like a participant and more like a witness to a miracle. They worked for what felt like hours, a grueling, frozen purgatory of shouting and riding until the last of the red-hided cattle were driven through the wide doors of the southern barn. The silence inside the structure was deafening after the roar of the storm. The air was thick with the steam rising from 300 overheated bodies and the smell of wet wool. Levi slid from his saddle, his legs trembling from exhaustion and adrenaline. Across the aisle, the stranger was already dismounting, moving to loosen the cinch on their heaving horse. Levi walked over, his boots crunching on the straw, his chest heaving. "Who are you?" His voice rasped, rough with cold and disbelief. The figure paused, then slowly unwound the scarf. It was a woman. She looked up, and Levi was struck by the color of her eyes, a clear, shifting grey-green that reminded him of creek water running over slate. Her face was pale, drawn with exhaustion, but her expression held a fierce, guarded intelligence. "Does it matter?" she asked, her voice low and husky. "You just saved 300 head. They needed saving." She turned back to her horse, lifting a hoof to check for stones, effectively dismissing him. Levi stood there, water dripping from the brim of his hat, struggling to reconcile the situation. He was a man who owed nothing to anyone, and suddenly he owed his entire existence to a woman who wouldn't even give him her name. He watched her hands. They were gloved, but her movements were precise, efficient, and gentle. She touched the animal with an authority that couldn't be faked. This was no drifter who had picked up riding on a whim. She had ranching in her blood. "At least tell me your name," he pressed, stepping closer but respecting the invisible barrier she radiated. She hesitated, her back to him, before finally answering. "Kara. That's it. Just Kara." She moved past him to check the nearest heifer, running a hand over its flank. "Storm's not done," she stated flatly, looking up at the rafters where the wind was singing through the gaps. "You got feed stored here. They'll need it to keep their heat up." She began walking the line of cattle, assessing them for injuries, completely ignoring the fact that she had just performed a feat of heroism that most men would be boasting about for years. They worked through the darkening afternoon in a silence that was thick with unspoken questions. Levi followed her lead, realizing quickly that she saw things he had missed, a calf that looked colicky, a water trough that was beginning to skim over with ice. She worked with a desperate intensity, as if stopping would allow the cold to finally claim her. As night fell, the temperature plummeted further, the barn becoming a refrigerator. Levi finally caught her arm as she passed him with a pitchfork. "Come inside," he said, his voice firm. "The house is warm. You can't stay in this barn all night." Kara pulled away gently but decisively. "I'm used to rougher," she said, her chin lifting in a gesture of stubborn pride that Levi recognized all too well in his own mirror. "I appreciate the offer, but I don't need it. The tack room is fine. It has a wood stove and a cot. I've slept in worse places." She didn't wait for his rebuttal. She walked to the small room at the far end of the barn, opened the door, and slipped inside, the latch clicking with a sound of finality that echoed in the vast space. Levi stood alone in the snow-filled gap between the barn and his house, the storm screaming around him like a banshee. He looked back at the barn, where a faint glow of lamplight now spilled from the tack room window. He was baffled. A stranger had materialized out of the ether, saved his livelihood, worked herself to the bone, and now refused a hot meal and a warm bed. It violated every code of hospitality he knew, yet he couldn't force her. There was a wall around her as high and thick as the one he had built around himself. He trudged back to his empty house, the wind nearly knocking him off his feet. Inside, the silence of the rooms felt different tonight, heavier, charged with the knowledge that he was not as self-sufficient as he had told himself for 20 years. He sat in his kitchen, the storm raging against the glass, and thought about the woman sleeping in his tack room. He wondered what kind of storm she was running from that made a blizzard seem like a safe harbor. He didn't know it yet, but the ice around his heart had just developed its first hairline fracture. The storm raged for 3 days, a relentless siege of wind and ice that turned the world into a claustrophobic white room. Each morning, fighting his way through waist-deep drifts to the barn, Levi expected to find the stranger gone or huddled in defeat by the stove. Instead, he found Kara already working. She moved through the dim, hay-scented air with a terrifying kind of discipline, breaking the inch-thick ice on the water troughs with a heavy iron bar and mucking stalls with a rhythm that spoke of muscle memory ingrained since childhood. She worked like someone trying to outrun a ghost, her movements sharp and ceaseless, as if pausing would allow whatever she was fleeing to catch up. Levi joined her, and they worked in a synchronized silence that was strangely intimate. There were no orders given, no questions asked, just the shared primal language of labor, the scrape of shovels, the grunt of lifting heavy bales, and the low, soothing murmurs they both offered to the nervous herd. On the second day, Levi brought a thermos of coffee and hot biscuits wrapped in a grease-stained cloth to the barn. Kara accepted them with a curt nod, her hands shaking slightly as she reached for the cup. Levi noticed her hands then, really noticed them. They were red and chapped from the cold but mapped with old silver scars, the jagged tear of barbed wire, the burn of a rope, the callous patterns that only come from years of wrestling living things. "You know cattle," Levi said, leaning against a stall door as she ate with the rapid efficiency of someone who didn't know when the next meal was coming. "My father was a rancher," she said, her voice rough. Her jaw tightened, a subtle flexing of muscle that shut the door on further questions. Levi knew that look. He had worn it himself for 20 years. It was the look of someone guarding a wound that refused to close. He didn't push. He simply finished his coffee and picked up a pitchfork, stepping into the rhythm beside her. By the afternoon of the third day, the wind began to lose its demonic fury, shifting to a mournful howl as the storm broke. Pale, watery light filtered through the cracks in the barn siding, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. Levi went out to assess the damage. Fences down in 2 sections, a shed roof collapsed under the weight of the snow, hay stores depleted, but the herd was intact. When he returned to the barn, he found Kara leaning against the tack room doorframe, her face the color of old parchment. She was swaying slightly, her eyes unfocused. "You need food," Levi said, his voice leaving no room for argument this time. "Real food, not biscuits. Come up to the house. I have stew on the stove." A ghost of a smile, sharp and cynical, crossed her face. "Sweet talker," she muttered, pushing herself off the doorframe. "I appreciate it, but I don't need charity. Storm's breaking. I'll be moving on." Levi felt a flash of frustration burn in his chest. "It's not charity. You saved my herd. That's wages. And where are you moving on to? The roads are impassable." "Nowhere in particular," she said, turning back to the shadows. Levi stepped into her path, blocking her retreat. The frustration in his chest had morphed into something else, a desperate need to understand this woman who would rather freeze than accept a debt. "Why did you help me if you won't let me help you back?" he demanded. She stopped, her back to him, her shoulders rigid under the worn canvas coat. When she turned, her eyes were fierce, blazing with a sudden, raw intensity. "Because your cattle were dying," she said, the words heavy and final. "That's reason enough." She looked ready to collapse, her body trembling with a fatigue she could no longer hide. Levi softened his tone. "The roads will be better tomorrow. Stay one more night. I could use help checking the foal damage in the morning." It was a lie. He didn't need help checking fences, but it was the only currency she seemed willing to accept. Work. She studied his face, searching for pity and finding only respect. One more day, she whispered. Then I'm gone. Levi didn't sleep that night. He lay in his warm house, listening to the silence that had replaced the wind, thinking about the woman shivering in his tack room. He found her at dawn on the fourth morning, not working, but collapsed in the aisle between the cattle stalls. His heart hammered against his ribs as he ran to her, dropping to his knees in the straw. She was unconscious, her skin radiating a terrifying dry heat. When he lifted her, she was shockingly light, as if the storm had scoured away everything but bone and spirit. Panic, cold and unfamiliar, seized him. He carried her to the house, kicking the back door open, and laid her in the guest room that hadn't seen a visitor in a decade. She had worked herself past exhaustion, fueled by nothing but stubbornness and adrenaline, and now her body was demanding the price. He piled quilts over her shaking form and started boiling water, falling back on the only medical knowledge he had, nursing sick calves. He hoped people weren't so different. The fever held her for 3 days. It was a violent, consuming fire that sent her drifting in and out of consciousness. Levi sat beside the bed, cooling her forehead with damp cloths, watching the shadows lengthen and shorten across the floorboards. In the grip of the fever, her guard came down. She mumbled in her sleep, fragments of a life she had kept locked away spilling out into the quiet room. The drought came in June, she whispered to the ceiling, her eyes wide but seeing nothing. Grass turned brown, creek dried up. Papa said it would break. Levi leaned in, listening to the tragedy unfold in broken sentences. She spoke of selling the herd piece by piece, of watching trucks carry away generations of breeding stock. He died in October, she gasped, tears leaking from the corners of her eyes. Heart failure, the doctor said. I know better. He died of losing everything. Levi held her hand, anchoring her against the memories. Sarah Cara Morrison, she murmured. Papa called me Cara because I kicked like one. On the second night, when her thrashing subsided into a fitful sleep, Levi found himself speaking back to the darkness. It felt easier to confess to a sleeping stranger than to the empty walls he had talked to for years. My father was a gambler, Levi said quietly, dipping the cloth into the basin. Cards, horses, anything with odds. He lost our homestead when I was 19. He looked at Cara's flushed face, seeing the mirror image of his own loss. I swore I'd build something no one could take away. I spent 24 years building fences, pushing everyone out so I wouldn't have to rely on a soul. He paused, his voice cracking. Until now. Until you rode out of that white hell and saved what I couldn't save alone. He realized then that his fortress had a fatal flaw. It kept the world out, but it locked him in with his own ghosts. Sitting there, watching her chest rise and fall, the solitude he had cherished suddenly felt like a prison sentence. The fever broke on the third night, snapping like a dry twig. Levi had dozed off in the hard wooden chair, his neck cricked at a painful angle. He woke to the sensation of being watched. Pale dawn light was washing the room in soft greys, and Cara's eyes were open. They were clear, the fever haze gone, leaving them the color of river stones underwater. She looked around the room, confusion warring with recognition, until her gaze landed on him. Your cattle, she rasped, her voice a dry croak. Levi let out a breath he felt he'd been holding for days. Safe, he said gently. All of them safe. Tears welled in her eyes and slid silently into her hair. Good. That's good. She tried to sit up but fell back, weak as a kitten. I collapsed, she stated, the memory returning. You worked yourself nearly to death, Levi corrected. I'm sorry, she whispered. Don't be sorry, Levi said, reaching out to take her scarred hand. Be better. She looked at him, her defenses crumbling. I wasn't strong enough to save my father's ranch, she confessed, her voice trembling. I thought maybe I could save someone else's. Levi squeezed her hand. You did save it, Cara. You saved everything. Recovery for Cara Morrison was not a surrender to rest, but a battle against it. She treated her own weakness with the same impatient disdain she might show a stubborn mule. The very day after her fever broke, while her legs were still trembling like a newborn colt's, she insisted on getting out of bed. Levi found her in the kitchen, gripping the edge of the sink until her knuckles turned white, staring out the window toward the barn. "Sit down before you fall down," Levi ordered, his voice carrying the rough edge of concern. She turned, her face pale but her jaw set in that familiar, unyielding line. "I can work," she said, though the sway in her stance betrayed her. "You can barely stand," Levi countered, moving to guide her toward a chair. She flinched away from his hand, her pride flaring up like a struck match. "I don't take charity, Levi. I've told you that." Levi looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the reflection of his own rigid code. She wasn't rejecting kindness. She was rejecting the terrifying feeling of being indebted. Levi shifted tactics, moving from benefactor to businessman. He knew the only way to keep her there was to make it a transaction. "It's not charity if you earn it," he said, leaning against the doorframe, crossing his arms. "And you've already earned it by saving my herd. But if you want to settle the ledger, stay through calving season, April and May. That's 7 weeks. He watched her calculate the offer, weighing her physical limitations against her need for purpose. "I need skilled hands," he lied smoothly. He had managed alone for decades, but he knew he couldn't manage the silence of the house anymore. "Help me then when you're strong enough to actually be of use." Kara studied his face, suspicion warring with a desperate kind of hope. "Wages," she said finally. "Fair wages for skilled work. And I don't stay in your house. It's not proper." Levi nodded, anticipating this. "The foreman's cabin. It's been empty since old Martin retired 5 years ago. Needs fixing up, leaks a bit in the rain, but the wood is sound. I pay rent," Kara added, her voice gaining strength. Levi had to bite the inside of his cheek to suppress a smile. She was destitute, owning nothing but the clothes on her back and a horse, yet she was negotiating like a land baron. "Fine, $10 a month." "20, she countered instantly. "You're negotiating to pay me more?" Levi asked, incredulous. "I'm negotiating for dignity," she shot back, her creekwater eyes locking onto his. "I stay in that cabin. I work for wages. I pay rent. Nothing given, nothing owed. That is the only way I stay." Levi recognized the iron in her voice. It was the same resolve that had driven her through a blizzard to save cattle that weren't hers. He extended his hand. "Deal." Her grip was weak, lacking its usual crushing strength, but the shake was firm. In that handshake, the dynamic shifted. They were no longer rescuer and victim. They were partners in a contract carved out of stubbornness and necessity. 2 days later, the sound of horses' hooves clattered in the yard, shattering the morning quiet. Levi stepped onto the porch to see Tom and Eleanor Patterson, his nearest neighbors, riding up with Doc Wheeler and his wife Martha. It was a welfare check, disguised as a social call. "Heard you weathered the storm all right," Tom called out as he dismounted, his eyes darting past Levi to the barn. "Also heard you've got company." Levi stiffened. Small towns had a communication network faster than the telegraph, fueled entirely by speculation. Kara appeared in the barn doorway then, looking thin but upright, a pitchfork in her hand. "This is Kara Morrison," Levi said, his voice projecting across the yard. "She's working for me through calving season." Eleanor Patterson, a woman whose moral compass was as rigid as her corset, raised a skepticism eyebrow. "Working for you?" she repeated, the words dripping with implication. "Skilled ranch hand," Levi said shortly. "Knows cattle better than most men I've hired." Eleanor's gaze swept over Kara, taking in the men's clothing, the rough hands, the proximity to Levi's bachelor existence. "I see," she said, her tone sharp enough to cut glass. "And she is staying where, exactly?" Levi felt a surge of heat up his neck, not shame, but anger. "Foreman's cabin," he said. "Of course," Eleanor said, pressing her lips into a thin, white line. She turned her gaze back to Levi, dropping her voice to a stage whisper that was meant to be heard. "Levi, people will talk. A woman alone, out here." The sentence hung in the air, heavy with judgment. For 43 years, Levi had lived a life of impeccable, if isolated, respectability. He paid his bills, minded his business, and gave no one cause to gossip. But looking at Eleanor's pinched face and then back at Kara, who stood tall and defiant in the barn door, bracing herself for the rejection she clearly expected, something in Levi snapped. The carefully constructed walls of his reputation suddenly seemed made of paper. "Let them," Levi said. The words surprised him as much as they did the neighbors. "Let them talk." Doc Wheeler cleared his throat, sensing the volatility of the moment. "Now, Levi, it's not our business how you run your ranch. We just wanted to check you didn't lose too much in the storm." Levi stepped off the porch, walking until he stood between the neighbors and Kara, a physical shield. "I lost some fence and a shed roof," he said, his voice hard. "I could have lost everything. Miss Morrison drove my cattle to shelter when I was face down in a snowbank. She saved my livelihood. I owe her more than I can repay. If people want to talk about where she sleeps, that says more about their minds than her character." The silence that followed was total. Eleanor flinched as if slapped. "Well," she huffed, gathering her reins, "we certainly didn't mean to intrude." As they turned their horses to leave, Levi didn't watch them go. He turned to the barn. Kara was gone. He found her in the foreman's cabin, furiously shoving her few belongings back into her worn canvas bag. Her movements were jerky, fueled by humiliation. "What are you doing?" Levi asked from the doorway. "Leaving," she said without looking up. "I won't be the cause of your reputation getting dragged through the mud." "My reputation isn't your concern," Levi said. "It should be." She spun around, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I know how this goes, Levi. I know what they think. A woman alone staying on a bachelor's ranch. They'll call me a whore and you a fool. I won't let you take that heat for me." Levi stepped into the dusty room. "Easy to say when it's not your life they're destroying," she added bitterly. Levi took a deep breath, steadying himself. "You saved my life. You saved my ranch. That is the truth. Anyone who can't see that isn't worth the air they're breathing." "Wait! You don't understand," she pleaded, gripping the strap of her bag. "I understand you've been hurt," Levi interrupted, his voice dropping to a gentle rumble. "I understand you're running from losing everything. I understand you don't trust easily because the world hasn't given you a reason to." He took a step closer. "I also understand I need help. You need work. The foreman's cabin sits empty. Everything else is just noise, Kara, just wind." Her hands stilled on the bag. She looked at him, searching for the catch, the hidden agenda. "Why?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Why do you care what happens to me?" The question stopped him cold. He thought about the silence of his house, the years of eating alone, the cold comfort of independence. "I don't know," he admitted, and it was the most honest thing he had ever said. "But I do." He gently took the bag from her hand and set it on the floor. "Unpack. We have fences to fix tomorrow." Late May brought the green back to the world, turning the rolling hills into a vibrant, undulating sea of grass, but it also brought Richard Thornton. The banker arrived in a sleek black automobile that looked violently out of place against the weathered timber and dust of the ranch, a mechanical beetle crawling up the driveway. Levi met him in the small, austere office off the kitchen, knowing instinctively that a personal visit from a man who lived in a world of ledgers and ink meant the news was too heavy for a letter. Thornton was not a cruel man, but he was a mathematician of misfortune. He spread his papers across Levi's desk, the crisp white sheets contrasting with the scarred oak. "Cattle prices have bottomed out," Thornton said, adjusting his spectacles. "They're down 30% from last fall, Levi. Add in the feed costs from the storm, the veterinary bills, and the materials for the barn repairs. The margins have evaporated." Levi stared at the columns of numbers, his stomach tightening into a cold knot. It was happening again. The ghost of his father sat in the corner of the room, whispering that no matter how hard you worked, the house always won. "How bad is it?" Levi asked, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "You're hovering at your credit limit," Thornton replied, tapping a finger on the bottom line. "You need a flawless calf crop and a miracle in the autumn markets. If you don't get both, we'll be looking at liquidating assets to cover the debt." "Land," Levi said flatly. "A quarter section, likely the south pasture." The thought made Levi's blood run cold. That land was his blood, his sweat, his identity. Thornton leaned back, his expression sympathetic but firm. "There is also the matter of your overhead, the summer help." He didn't say Kara's name, but it hung in the air between them. "Can you justify the expense?" "I'm not speaking of small-town gossip, Levi. I'm speaking of arithmetic. If you're paying fair wages for labor you used to do alone, the numbers don't support it." After the banker's car disappeared back down the dirt road, Levi sat alone in the dim office for a long time. The math was unassailable. Keeping Kara was a luxury, and he was a man on the brink of bankruptcy. He found her in the south pasture, repairing a section of barbed wire that a spooked elk had torn down. She wore a faded blue shirt and leather gloves that were worn smooth at the palms. She looked up as he approached, wiping sweat from her brow, and her smile died instantly when she saw the look on his face. Levi didn't have the heart to dance around it. "Prices are down," he said, the words tasting like ash. "The storm damage cost more than the reserve held. I can't afford you through the summer, Kara." He watched her face go carefully, terrifyingly blank. It was a defense mechanism he knew well, the sudden shuttering of the soul. "I understand," she said quietly. "I can pay you through the end of the month," Levi continued, hating every syllable. "Give you a solid reference." "I understand," she repeated, her voice devoid of emotion, though her hands gripped the fencing pliers so hard the leather groaned. "When do you want me gone?" "It's not about wanting," Levi said, stepping closer. "It's about survival." She nodded once, turned back to the fence, and hammered a staple into the post with 3 violent, precise strikes. "I'll be out by the 1st. Levi walked back to the house, leaving her alone with the wire and the wind. He felt a profound sense of failure, not just as a rancher, but as a man. He had offered her sanctuary, and now he was evicting her because he couldn't balance a checkbook. That evening, as he sat staring at his cold dinner, a knock came at the door. Kara stood there holding a rolled-up piece of paper. "I have a proposal," she said, her voice carrying a tremor of nerves she was trying desperately to hide. "Can I come in?" They sat at the kitchen table, the lamp casting long, dancing shadows against the walls. She spread out a hand-drawn map. It was detailed, drawn with the intimate knowledge of someone who had walked every inch of the terrain. "My father's ranch," she said, pointing to a square of land 2 counties over. "I still own it. The bank took the stock, but the deed is clear. 160 acres, a year-round creek, decent grass. The house and barn are standing." Levi looked at the map, then at her. "Without cattle, it's just scenery," he said gently. "I know," she said, leaning forward, her eyes burning with that same intensity he had seen in the storm. "So stake me. 25 bred heifers from your surplus stock. I take them to my place. I pay you back in calves over 3 years, plus interest. We run the operations as a partnership. We share equipment, we share labor. Your hay, my winter pasture. We double our grazing capacity and split the risk." Levi stared at her. It was insane. It was the kind of gamble his father would have made on a pair of jacks. "Kara, if prices don't recover, we both lose everything. I lose my surplus, you lose your land." "Yes," she said unflinchingly. "But if we do nothing, you lose your south pasture, and I drift until I die." "Why would you do this?" Levi asked. She swallowed hard, looking down at her hands. "Because I believe in good bones. Your ranch has them. Mine does too. And because I am tired of running, I'd rather fail trying to build something than spend my life afraid to try." Levi rode out to her father's ranch at dawn the next morning, needing to see the reality behind the map. It was a heartbreaking sight. The house was solid but shabby, the white paint peeling like dead skin, the porch boards warped from neglect. The fields had gone to weed and thistle, and the fences sagged like old clotheslines. But as he walked the property, Levi saw what she saw. The barn was framed with heavy, rot-resistant cedar. The creek ran clear and fast even in late May. The soil in the lower pasture was dark and rich. It was a place of potential, sleeping under a blanket of grief. He found Kara waiting for him on the porch steps, her arms wrapped around her knees. "You came to see if I'm crazy," she said, not looking up. "Or a fool," Levi added, dismounting. He walked up the steps and sat beside her. The wood groaned under his weight. "It's a mess," he said honestly. "Good bones, though," she whispered. "My father said a ranch is a promise that what you build matters, that it will outlast you. I want to honor that." They sat in silence for a long time, looking out over the overgrown fields that were begging to be worked. Levi felt the familiar tug of fear, the old instinct to retreat behind his walls, to hoard what little he had, and trust no one. But looking at the weeds, he realized that isolation wasn't safety. It was just a slow way of dying. "I'm scared," he admitted, his voice low, "of losing the money, of wanting this, of trusting that it could work." He turned to face her. "I spent my whole life making sure I never needed anyone, because if you need someone, you give them the power to destroy you." Kara pressed her shoulder against his, a warm, solid weight. "I know," she said, "but maybe never needing anything, never building anything that matters. Maybe that's worse. She looked at him, her eyes searching his face. Partners? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Levi looked at the ruin of the ranch, and then at the woman who had ridden through a blizzard to save him. He took a breath, inhaling the scent of sage and rain. Partners, he said, and shook her hand. That night, they sat at his kitchen table again, drafting the agreement by lamplight. It was a formal business contract. Heifers for calves, shared labor schedules, resource allocation. They discussed numbers and logistics with a dry, careful practicality, pretending this was solely about economics. But the air in the room was charged with something else. When they both reached for the inkwell, their fingers brushed, and the contact sent a jolt through Levi that had nothing to do with business. He pulled his hand back, his heart hammering. He saw Kara's breath hitch, her eyes widening slightly. They stared at each other across the table, the silence stretching thin and taut. They were two lonely people who had built fortresses around their hearts, now standing at the gates with the keys in their hands. Finally, Kara signed the paper with a steady hand. Levi added his signature below hers. "This is really happening," she murmured. "We just tied our futures together." Levi looked at the signatures, Dawson and Morrison. On paper, it's a partnership, he thought. In reality, it's a promise. May blurred into June, and the work began in earnest. It was grueling, back-breaking labor that left no time for second thoughts. They moved the 25 heifers to her land, driving them slowly across the county line. They spent days repairing her fences, stretching new wire until their hands were blistered and raw. Kara's house began to wake up. Levi helped her scrape and paint the siding, while she helped him re-shingle his barn roof. They fell into a rhythm that felt deceptively like a marriage. Shared meals, shared worries, shared exhaustion. Levi found himself watching her when he thought she wouldn't notice. The way she wiped grease from her cheek, the way she sang low in her throat to calm the horses, the way she looked at the sunset with a hunger he understood perfectly. The distance between them was shrinking, measured now not in miles or walls, but in inches on a porch swing. The partnership was working, defying the banker's odds. But the real gamble wasn't the cattle. It was the terrifying, exhilarating risk of letting someone in. May burned into June, and June scorched into July, the seasons marking time not on a calendar, but in the growing height of the blue-stem grass and the thickening coats of the cattle. The partnership, born of desperation and signed by lamplight, operated with a seamless efficiency that surprised everyone, including Levi and Kara. They moved the herd between the two properties, rotating pastures with a strategic precision that maximized every acre of grazing land. Kara's house, once a monument to grief, began to breathe again. Fresh white paint gleamed on the siding, the porch boards were nailed flat, and curtains appeared in the windows, fluttering like flags of surrender to hope. The neighbors, initially watching with the predatory gaze of vultures waiting for a carcass, saw the undeniable results. The calves were heavy and sleek, the fences were tight as bowstrings, and the two ranches were humming with a vitality neither had possessed alone. Even Tom Patterson, a man who regarded compliments as a sign of weakness, grunted his approval one afternoon while watching them drive a herd along the county road. "You two run a tight ship," he admitted, tipping his hat. It was the highest praise he was capable of giving. Late August brought the rains, not a violent storm this time, but a deep, soaking downpour that smelled of wet slate and salvation. Levi was in the lower barn, mending a bridle, when he heard Kara shouting his name. The panic in her voice sent a jolt of adrenaline through him, and he sprinted toward the sound, fearing an injury. He found her in the birthing stall of her own barn, but she wasn't hurt. She was standing in the straw, soaked to the bone, laughing through tears. Behind her, a heifer, one of the 25 he had staked her, was licking a newborn calf. It was a sturdy, red-white creature, struggling to stand on wobbly legs, bleating its arrival into the world. "Look," Kara whispered, grabbing Levi's arm as he skidded to a halt. "The first one, the first calf of the partnership." Levi looked at the animal, blinking away the rain that dripped from the brim of his hat. It wasn't just livestock. It was proof. It was the physical manifestation of the risk they had taken, breathing and alive. "She's perfect," Levi said, his voice thick. "We did it," Kara said, turning to him, her face radiant in the dim light. "We actually did it, Levi." The distance they had so carefully maintained, the professional buffer zone of business partners, suddenly evaporated. Levi looked at her, wet hair plastered to her cheeks, eyes shining like the creek water after a thaw, and realized he had run out of excuses to be alone. He reached out, his calloused hands cupping her face, feeling the warmth of her skin against the chill of the rain. "Kara Morrison," he murmured, "you saved a hell of a lot more than my cattle." Her hands came up to grip his wrists, anchoring him there. The kiss was tentative at first, a question asked in the silence of the barn, but when she sighed against him, it deepened into an answer. It tasted of rain and relief, of months of suppressed longing finally breaking the surface. When they pulled apart, breathless, the only sound was the calf nursing loudly in the stall. "I love you," Levi said, the words tumbling out before he could second-guess them. "Since the storm?" she teased gently. "Since before I knew it," he answered. September arrived with crisp mornings and the golden haze of harvest. Levi and Kara combined their households with the same practicality they applied to their herds. "Your house has more room," Kara conceded over coffee one morning. "But yours has the better view of the mountains," Levi countered. They compromised, splitting time between the two, weaving their lives together until the seam was invisible. Richard Thornton returned in mid-September, bracing himself for bad news, only to find the books balanced and the credit line clear. "I'll be damned," the banker muttered, cleaning his spectacles as if seeing the numbers clearly for the first time. "You pulled it off. A strong calf crop, reduced overhead, shared resources. It's a textbook recovery." He closed his ledger with a snap. "I can extend your credit on significantly better terms next year. In fact, the bank would be happy to finance an expansion." Levi looked at Kara, sitting across the desk. "We're good on expansion for now," Levi said, smiling. "We're focusing on consolidation." The final seal of approval came in the form of a pie. Eleanor Patterson arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, carrying a warm apple crumble covered in a checkered cloth. "I was wrong," she stated simply, standing on the porch. Eleanor was not a woman who apologized often, and she did it with the stiffness of a royal decree. "I judged the situation without knowing the facts. You've built something good here." After she left, Tom Patterson lingered by his truck. "Got a young fellow looking for work?" he grunted, kicking at a dirt clod. "Name's Danny Ross, 19, drifter type. Reminded me of, well, someone." He shot a meaningful glance at Kara. "Send him over," Kara said immediately. Danny arrived the next morning, skinny, eyes darting nervously, trying to project a toughness he didn't possess. He had the look of a stray dog expecting a kick. "I know horses," the boy stammered. "I'll work hard. I just need a chance." Levi looked at the boy, then at Kara. He saw the recognition in her eyes. "The foreman's cabin is empty," Levi said. "Stove works, but it needs wood. You start tomorrow." That evening, Levi and Kara sat on the porch of the main house, rocking in two chairs that sat close enough for their elbows to touch. The sun was setting, painting the sky in violent streaks of violet and orange, the same sky that had once promised a killer storm, now promising only rest. In the distance, a plume of smoke rose from the chimney of the foreman's cabin. Danny was settling in. "You ever regret it?" Levi asked quietly, watching the smoke rise. "Giving up the drifting?" Kara reached out and took his hand, lacing her fingers through his. "I wasn't drifting, Levi. I was lost. There's a difference." She gestured toward the pasture, where their combined herd was grazing, a sea of rust-red hides against the gold grass. "That's not just a ranch out there. That's a promise kept. My father would have liked this. He would have liked you." "My father would have bet against us," Levi chuckled darkly, "but he would have been wrong." The light faded, and the first stars began to prick the velvet canopy above them. They sat in comfortable silence, the kind that doesn't need to be filled with chatter. They were two people who had been hollowed out by loss, who had built fortresses of solitude to protect what little they had left. But the storm had come and knocked those walls down, leaving them exposed long enough to find each other. Levi thought about the good bones Kara had spoken of. She was right. The land had good bones, but so did they. They had built a life not on the fragile luck of a gambler, but on the solid bedrock of shared burden and shared joy. "Spring will be busy," Kara murmured, her head resting on his shoulder. "Calving starts early." "We'll be ready," Levi said, squeezing her hand. We weathered the winter. We can handle the spring. Above them, the universe wheeled in its infinite cold silence. But on the porch, in the circle of lamplight and warmth, Levi Dawson finally knew what it meant to be home.